Buenas tardes a todas y todos. El proyecto Manejo Integrado de los Recursos Hídricos de las Cuencas Binacionales Mira, Mataje y Carchi-Guaitara entre Colombia y Ecuador, ejecutado por el Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible de Colombia y el Ministerio de Ambiente y Agua y Transición Ecológica del Ecuador, con el apoyo de del Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo y Global Water Partnership Sudamérica, les dan la más cordial bienvenida a este evento de charlas magistrales sobre género y la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos en el contexto de aguas transfronterizas. Mi nombre es Verónica Guzmán, parte del equipo de Global Water Partnership y tendré el honor de moderar este evento. Instrucciones generales. Ya que contamos con expositoras tanto de habla inglesa como habla hispana, tenemos 2 canales de interpretación simultánea. Por favor, en el icono de interpretación, seleccione español si desea escuchar todo el evento en este idioma y de igual manera seleccione inglés si desea escucharlo en dicho idioma. For the English speakers, simultaneous interpretation is available. Please, in the interpretation icon, select the option English. Cualquier pregunta o comentario debe ser enviado en el chat en español o inglés. Nuestras intérpretes nos ayudarán con la traducción a las ponentes. Por favor, mantener los micrófonos apagados si no está en uso de la palabra. Iniciamos. Palabras de bienvenida a cargo de Sebastián Izquierdo, coordinador binacional del proyecto. Sebastián, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Verónica, y buenas tardes con todas y todos. Es un honor y es un gusto para mí poderles acompañar y darles la bienvenida y agradecerles por su participación en esta tarde para compartir con Global Water Partnership estas charlas magistrales sobre género y la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos. Como muchos de ustedes saben, entre Ecuador y Colombia se está desarrollando este proyecto de manejo integrado de los recursos hídricos en 3 de las cuencas que compartimos con Colombia, las cuencas Mira, Mataje y Carchi-Guaitara, y justamente buscamos fortalecer la gobernanza, fortalecer la gestión entre ambos países en estos territorios, y este evento es muy importante para nosotros porque es fortalecer los temas relacionados a género, ¿no? Este proyecto se ejecuta con fondos del GED, a través del Programa de las Naciones Unidas del Desarrollo y, lógicamente, con la ejecución de ambos ministerios del ambiente de ambos países, MinAmbiente en el lado colombiano y el MATE en el lado ecuatoriano. Entonces, quiero agradecer igual a Global Water Partnership, a todos los colegas que el día de hoy nos estarán acompañando con sus charlas magistrales, porque sin duda serán de mucha utilidad. Estas charlas magistrales también es bueno y es interesante indicar que se enmarcan dentro de un curso un poco más de largo aliento, de varias sesiones, en las cuales estamos teniendo con varios socios del proyecto, pero habíamos visto conveniente tener un evento que pueda ser abierto al público, a otros actores que sin duda el día de hoy nos acompañan y que también se puedan ver beneficiadas de estas charlas, y tendremos la oportunidad a lo largo del proyecto, ojalá, de poderles incluir en otros eventos también un poco más largos, ¿no? Entonces, sin más, agradecerles y darles la bienvenida y desearles éxitos en la jornada.
Muchísimas gracias, Sebastián. A continuación tendremos los objetivos del evento y la presentación de las expositoras a cargo de Araceli Pazmiño, especialista de género de Global Water Partnership Sudamérica. Araceli.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias, Verónica. Durante los últimos 40 años, la evidencia muestra que simplemente incluir a las mujeres y otros participantes vulnerables en los procesos de toma de decisiones no es suficiente para garantizar su participación significativa. Las mujeres y las personas vulnerables de cualquier sociedad se enfrentan a una serie de obstáculos sociales, culturales, económicos, incluso físicos, que les impiden participar plenamente. La gestión y el desarrollo participativos del agua brindan a mujeres y hombres oportunidades de empoderamiento y poder de decisión sobre sus propias vidas, su sustento y su entorno. El género y los recursos hídricos están intrínsecamente vinculados. Como tal, debemos aprender a aplicar una gestión sostenible e inclusiva de los recursos hídricos para garantizar la resiliencia en un mundo de clima cambiante, con una participación significativa de todas las partes interesadas. El presente foro tiene como objetivo reflexionar sobre la relación entre igualdad de género y la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos en el contexto de aguas transfronterizas. Este foro busca traer a Sudamérica experiencias desde el contexto global para aprender de las diversas realidades donde se experimentan y se comparten los retos y los desafíos para alcanzar la igualdad de género. Para este foro hemos convocado a 3 especialistas internacionales de gran trayectoria. Es un placer presentarles a todos ustedes a las expositoras. Empiezo con Yumiko Yasuda. quien es especialista senior en redes y cooperación en aguas transfronterizas de Global Water Partnership. Dirige el trabajo temático en esta institución sobre aguas transfronterizas y apoya las actividades de sus redes en el sudeste asiático y el Caribe, en lo que respecta a gobernanza, gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos, ODS, clima y agua. Su área de especialización radica en el análisis de la gobernanza ambiental y del agua, la diplomacia del agua, el análisis de la economía política en torno a la gestión de los recursos naturales, con un enfoque en los ríos transfronterizos y los compromisos de los actores no estatales en la gestión de los recursos naturales. Antes de trabajar en GWP, Yumiko trabajó en una amplia gama de sectores en el campo del agua y el medio ambiente, incluido Naciones Unidas, así como el sector privado, academia, organizaciones juveniles, ONG locales e internacionales. Contamos también esta tarde con Yasmina Rice El-Feni, quien se desempeña como oficial senior de programa y especialista de género en CAPNET del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo, PNUD. Yasmina es responsable de la implementación de las asociaciones estratégicas de todas las actividades de CAPNET a través de la incorporación de las perspectivas de género en sus políticas, presupuestos, informes y programas. Coordina a su vez la gestión del conocimiento, así como el desarrollo de la comunicación y la divulgación. Tiene más de una década de experiencia con organizaciones de las Naciones Unidas y con otras organizaciones vinculadas del desarrollo, donde ha apoyado en la elaboración de presupuestos sensibles al género. Yasmina apoya el desarrollo de la red Mujeres en la Diplomacia del Agua. Finalmente, presento a Jennifer Sireng, quien es parte del Delft Institute for Water Education. Actualmente se desempeña como profesora asociada en Gobernanza y Diplomacia del Agua. Su investigación y docencia se centran en la gobernanza del agua a nivel nacional, local, nacional y transfronterizo en los arreglos institucionales, así como las prácticas de cooperación y diplomacia del agua. Coordina el programa de maestría, cooperación y diplomado del agua, un programa conjunto entre el IHE de Delft, la Universidad de La Paz y la Universidad Estatal de Oregon. Tiene una amplia experiencia con diferentes organizaciones dedicadas a apoyar la cooperación en materia de agua, incluida la Unión Europea, Organizaciones para la Seguridad y Cooperación en Europa, el Ministerio Federal de Relaciones Exteriores de Alemania y la GIZ. En estos puestos, ella analizó y asesoró sobre aspectos relacionados sobre seguridad del agua y el medio ambiente. También participó en varios programas de gobernanza y diplomacia del agua. Bienvenidas todos ustedes, las depositadas, y le devuelvo el escenario a Verónica. Buenas tardes.
Muchísimas gracias, Araceli. Ahora le doy la palabra a Yumiko, quien nos hablará sobre las aguas transfronterizas bajo una introducción general. Yumiko, por favor.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Hello everyone, as introduced, my name is Yumiko, and today in my talk, I'll be giving a bit of an overview of transboundary water. Next slide, please. So when you say transboundary water, and also we use terminology international waters, what does it mean? It means the water system that is shared by two or more states. So such examples include like the large marine ecosystem. If you see on the diagram on the left up, it's like an example of the Black Sea that is shared between like different countries, like including Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Georgia, Russia, and so on. The Amazon River that is in your region, that is shared by so many countries, including Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and so on. Then there's also a shared basin, the lakes. So the Lake Titicaca is an example from your region that is shared between Bolivia and Peru. And then there's a transboundary aquifer, such an example of the Guarani Aquifer that is shared between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Typically, I think that we use this term transboundary waters more referring to the freshwater, whereas the terminology for international water can be referred to more including fresh and marine, but I don't really think there's a very clear definition on exact of this, although the UN water refers more on the freshwater when you say transboundary water, but that's more like a terminology. So conceptually, it's really the water system that is shared between two or more states. Next slide, please. So if you can look at this map, this shows the overview of where the transboundary water is in context of the fresh water. And the blue is the transboundary rivers and lakes, so that what you see on the surface, on the ground. And then the green part represent the transboundary aquifers, groundwater, so that is underneath. Currently, there are 310 transboundary lakes and river basins globally, and then 592 identified aquifers globally. So it's like a lot of transboundary waters. And of course, as an aquifer is something that you can't really see so easily. Well, when there is more scientific advancement, the numbers could change. And also sometimes the borders and government can change that affect these numbers. Currently, 153 states share these waters. And it's also it occupies about 52% of the entire Earth surface. Next slide, please. In the region where you are participating from, mostly, I would say you're mostly from South America, but also there are some other participants from other regions. In this context of South America, there are 38 transboundary basins where you can see the highlight on the left map. And then there's 29 transboundary aquifers. Next slide, please. Now, I'm looking at today's topic is really also talking about the integrated water resources management that also looks at the transboundary water cooperation. So here we are looking at different types of cooperation, and this is a famous diagram developed by Sadoff and Gray, where the countries start from non-cooperation status to like really joint activities, joint action, and going into integration. And along the line, the countries may start from really just communication, sharing information, and doing some regional assessment to really having a joint ownership, joint investment, joint institutions, and so on. So there's a different levels of cooperation. If you go to the next slide, please. There's also a different dimensions of cooperation that one can keep in mind. The geographic scale is one dimension. So the cooperation can be typically, people think that yes, cooperation is the whole basin. But sometimes cooperation can start from part of the basin, the river basin, the tributary of an entire basin. Or cooperation can also start at the regional level, not necessarily at just the basin level. And sometimes cooperation can also be just start from that bilateral. So not necessarily focusing on one basin, but two countries sharing 5 basins can start having some agreement on cooperations and so on. And then there's different tracks of cooperation. Track 1, and this is a terminology used in diplomacy, and track 1 is typically referred to cooperation among the governments, state governments, whereas the other tracks of cooperation are involving the state and non-state actor, which is track 1 and 0.5 and 2. And track 3 cooperation refers to the situation where it's more the citizens between the non-government actors are cooperating. And these different types of tracks of cooperation can actually happen simultaneously on the same transboundary water basins or even at the regional level. And that is referred to as multi-track water diplomacy. And these are different things. So I think people tend to think it's a government thing, but it's not. It's actually the cooperation can involve multiple stakeholders. Next slide, please. So just to give you some examples of the transboundary basin. So at the river basin level, so this is a bilateral level. An example from your region is in Ecuador and Peru that actually has started, initially the activity started the use of water resource at like joint activities in 1971 already. And then in 2009, the Binational Commission for the Integrated Management of the Zarumilla River Basin was established. And following that, there was an agreement to develop another binational project. And then in 2018, Peru and Ecuador Binational Integrated Water Resource Management Commission was established that covers 9 basins that are shared between these 2 countries. So this is one type of cooperation. Next slide, please. If you go to another type of cooperation is on the basin level. So the example of the Senegal River Basin in Africa, where several countries are sharing this river basin. And they established this organization, an institution, to manage the river and also do some joint investment and to share the benefit coming from the common water installations. So currently there's around 800 gigawatt per year of electricity production throughout the basin, which is shared among these different countries. And this also actually was being used, this kind of mechanism cooperation was used to really keep the peace as well, because there were sometimes this government particularly between Senegal and Mauritania, was not having some bit of difficulties, but then the Senegal River Development Organization played a role of almost like an arbitration between the countries. If you go to the next slide, please. Another type of cooperation at more the regional level. So the example is a regional dialogue that is happening in Central America. The Global Water Partnership Central America is cooperating with CCAD, the Sustainable Development Commission for Central America, which had a series of dialogue involving the key governments and stakeholders from the regions. And after 4 rounds of dialogue, they are now developing, the countries agreed to develop a joint regional guideline on transboundary water, and currently this is being developed. So there's, from the dialogue, this has also emerged into a regional level specific cooperation, and also through this dialogue, some ideas for cooperation on very specific basin is also emerging. There's been also a training on the water governance at IWRIM that was conducted in the context of these regional dialogues and cooperation. So as you can say, that, and this one is particularly involving the multi-stakeholders. It's a multi-stakeholder dialogue. So it's not just the government actor, but also the non-government actors are playing. So you can see from these examples that the cooperation can happen at the very different levels, but they all have the meanings to it. Next slide, please. I would like to touch upon the relationship between the Sustainable Development Goal, SDG, and transboundary water. Sustainable Development Goal itself, I think many people already know about it. It's a political commitment that global governments and leaders has committed to by 2030. And on the transboundary water, this transboundary water is under the target 6.5, which actually says by 2030 to implement integrated water resources management at all levels, including through transboundary corporations as appropriate. There are 2 indicators under this target, which is 6.5.1 that measures target towards achievement towards the degree of integrated water resources management in a scale of 0 to 100. Another indicator is 6.5.2, which measures the proportion of transboundary basin area with operational arrangement for water cooperation. So if you can look at the status, next slide, please. On the transboundary water for 6.5.1, this one is actually more like a self-assessment where stakeholders gather together to make some kind of scoring from between 0 to 100. And there's 4 categories related to transboundary water, enabling environment, whether there is a transboundary water arrangement, like formal commitments or so on, exist or not. And then also in institutional participation, whether there is a framework for that in the context of transboundary water. And the 3rd category is a management instrument, institutional technical mechanism in place. And then also the 4th is financing for cooperation. Next slide, please. So I'm just giving you a map. Next slide, please. Yes, on the first category of the enabling environment, this is the scoring of different countries in terms of the arrangement for transboundary water management. And you can see the global average score was 63 for the most recent survey. And Latin America, Caribbean region, this region is scoring a bit low, 38. So that means that not that many countries could say that we have appropriate level of arrangement for transboundary water management. Next slide, please. And then next slide is about the River Basin Organization or any other organizational arrangement exists. So again, the global score is 63, but then the Latin America and Caribbean is 40. Next slide, please. So if we go to this other SDG, which is 6.5.2, which is another target that measures the proportion of transboundary basin areas within a country with operational arrangement for water cooperation in place. So in this context, operational arrangement is referring to the treaty or conventions, international agreements, or to have a joint body, or even if they just have meetings annually or exchange the data more on a regular basis and so on. So next slide, please. In the most recent survey, this is the global map. So out of 153 countries that are sharing the basin, 129 countries have responded to this survey. And only 24 countries has actually responded that they have a perfect 100% transboundary arrangement is in place. And then 22 countries said they are around 70%. So it's still maybe I would say it's like 25 to 30% only countries would have this arrangement. Next slide, please. Now we looked at now I would like to also mention a little bit about SDG and the transboundary water, SDG more broadly, this relationship between transboundary water and SDG. So you can see the water is really heart of everything. Like, you know, without water, we cannot sustain life. And it really, water is really related to all different types of sustainable development goals. And so is transboundary water. So if you can go to next slide, please. The transboundary water cooperation can benefit, let's say they can actually develop, you know, if you develop a sustainable hydropower management, that can actually achieve the sustainable development goal on energy generation, which is target 7.2. If that can actually make the sustainable management of the forest through that, that can be also achieving 15.2. And also it can, hydropower dam can potentially, it's not all the time, I would say, but it can also make some resilience towards climate change related disaster, which also achieves 13.1, which is these are the target of the SDG. Next slide, please. Through the transboundary water cooperation, countries and stakeholders can also cooperate to improve the water quality. So to improve the better treatment of wastewater discharge, for instance, that would also improve the water quality and ecosystem health. That is also related to SDG 6. Next slide, please. The transboundary water cooperation can also really improve the efficient use of water and soil in agriculture. That also meets other SDG target and also support the food security and contribute to the poverty alleviation. So as you can see, transboundary water cooperation has many different impacts. Next slide, please. So in my last segment of the presentation, I would like to introduce some learning opportunities and exchange opportunities. So there is a massive open online course, MOOC, on governance for transboundary freshwater security. That is hosted by SDG Academy, and this was developed by GWP, Jeff I.W. Land, and many other partners, including IHE Delft, and that the Jennifer is from, the CapNet, where Jasmina is coming from, is hosting a French version of this course. We have a translation of this course, particularly the video materials, in 5 languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, and also and then Chinese, Russian, and French. So you're all welcome to take the course. I think this course can really give you an overview of different aspects of governance aspect of the transboundary water, where you can see the module content on the right side of this PowerPoint. Next slide, please. I would also like to introduce you to IWRM Action Hub, which is a new GWP's toolbox. I don't know if some of you may know about the IWRM toolbox, which actually includes different tools for integrated water resources management. The IWRM is typically divided into 4 different sort of action areas, which is the enabling environment, so like the policy and so on, and institutional arrangement, the organizational arrangement to really implement IWRM, and then the different management instrument, and then finance. These are the 4 categories of broader IWRM sort of concept. And then under this, there are currently 86 tools. If you can click, here's just an example of international water law. If you click there, you will see what is this tool. And then if you go to the next slide, Then under the tool, there are also case studies on how the tool is applied. And this is really interesting and also important because in a transboundary context, and let's say international water law context, let's say there's a key principle that you should manage the water in sustainable, equitable and reasonable way. And what does that exactly mean on the ground? This is a $100 million question because the operation can be so different from place to place, and people really learn from case studies. So the toolbox will really give you different case studies to really elaborate from. And then you can also submit your case study. If you see on this screen on the up here, there's a right button here. You can submit the case studies, and then we will be reviewing, and once it's accepted, it will be also part of the toolbox. So it's a very interactive feature, tools. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. Under this toolbox, there is also, we've created a community of transboundary water practitioners globally. This is called Transboundary Water Knowledge Exchange Hub. And through this hub, you'll be able to interact, exchange with different transboundary water professionals, scholars, whoever is interested in the field to really share a lot of knowledge. And there's also a lot of advertisement about the events, opportunities. If there's a job opening, people are posting it here. So you're all welcome to join the community. You can see the QR code. You can also join this from just going to our website, www.gwp.org, and look for the toolbox. So thank you very much. That's the next slide is my final, just a picture. Thank you so much. And I hope that my presentation gave you some ideas of what the transboundary water is. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Yumiko, por esta gran introducción a las aguas transfronterizas. Tengo dos preguntas que me hicieron por interno. Quisiera compartir la primera. Y luego, una vez que respondas a esa, te digo la siguiente, ¿no? La primera es, ¿cuál es el mecanismo que se puede utilizar en el caso de controversias o desacuerdos entre los países que comparten una cuenca transfronteriza?
So I think you can really use a different mechanism. I mean, really having a dialogue is really important, and also negotiations between on a specific topics. But sometimes, if the countries actually have such a situation, sometimes actually going to get to visit another place or even to really learn from other basins' experience, that can also give some inspirations, ideas, because the problem is if you are really stuck with your problems, it's difficult to see the situation outside of the box. And also the other thing is to really also look at the different multi-sectoral benefits. And this is really related to this topic, to the topic of this integrated water resources management. So often the countries may actually like just debate about how you share the water, the quantity of the water, but where are the benefits from that? And what are the different benefits of different sectors? And that can also really open up the different conversations. Taking out the border from the map, just to see the basin and to see how can you utilize these shared resources together, taking that view can also help. So there are different exercises that you can do to start working on the contentious situations.
Gracias, Yumiko. Ahora, una última pregunta, ya que estamos en este taller que va enfocado al género, ¿no? Me dicen, ¿existe un análisis de GWP sobre la relación del ODS 5, que es de género, y el ODS 6 de agua, y que se evidencia que hay aún muchos retos que alcanzar con respecto a esta conexión del agua y del género? En base a tu experiencia, ¿nos podrías comentar algo relacionado a esto? ¿Cuáles son los retos? ¿Qué se puede hacer un poco para alcanzar esta transversalización de género dentro del sector hídrico?
Yes, okay, thank you very much. I think this is going to be our common discussion point at the end. So, but I can just mention a little bit. I think there are different aspects, the gender, the water, the gender issues more in terms of the water users. gender issues when in terms of the decision making, that there are different levels that the gender issues can come in. What I have observed personally is that typically speaking, in a water sector at the top management and the decision making level, there's a less representation of women. And that can really affect the situation that and some of the voices are not heard. And I think that is like a real key issues that we all need to keep in mind. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. And I think it's also societal reasons as well. And so I think we need to not only to look at the gender issues from the water perspective, but it's actually a societal issues. So I will stop here and maybe I will come back to that question towards the end of the webinar.
Muchísimas gracias, Yumiko. Sí, al final tendremos una sesión que extenderemos un poquito más todos estos temas. Muchísimas gracias a las personas que hicieron las preguntas y ahora le voy a dar la palabra a Yasmina Raiz, quien nos va a hablar sobre el género, y la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos. Yasmina, por favor, la palabra es tuya.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Haré lo posible por hacer esta presentación en español. Next slide, please. El objetivo de esta presentación no es convertirnos a todos en expertos en género, sino hacernos comprender cómo el género y los recursos hídricos están intrínsecamente vinculados. Discutiremos por qué y cómo integrar el género a través de algunas herramientas y ejemplos. No integramos el género porque sea una exigencia de los donantes, sino que lo hacemos porque tiene sentido desde el punto de vista medioambiental, social y económico. Y por último, exploraremos formas de mejorar nuestras prácticas y adaptarlas para que sean más inclusivas y sostenibles, de modo que nadie se quede atrás. Next slide, please. Nuestro trabajo de género en la GIRE se basa en los principios de Dublín, que son reconocidos internacionalmente, donde se hace referencia específica a la participación inclusiva a todos los niveles y sitúa a las mujeres en la vanguardia del suministro, gestión y protección del agua. Next slide, please. El marco de Sendai es otro ejemplo de acuerdo internacional que hace referencia específica al papel fundamental de la participación de las mujeres en el diseño, gestión y la aplicación de iniciativas de reducción del riesgo de desastres. Next slide, please. Ok, vínculos entre el género y el manejo de recursos hídricos. El concepto de género se incluye como un criterio de monitoreo dentro del indicador ODS 651 debido a que la escasez de agua afecta de manera desproporcionada a las comunidades pobres y a las personas más marginadas en la sociedad. 2, el acceso al agua es relevante para el empoderamiento de las mujeres porque afecta aún más al acceso de las mujeres a la educación y la salud en relación con las enfermedades transmitidas por el agua, el embarazo y el parto, así como sus ingresos y su seguridad, como violencia de género. Y 3, la igualdad del género y el acceso del agua son derechos humanos básicos y por lo tanto son fundamentales para lograr los otros ODS. Next slide, please. ¿Por qué cómo integrar el género en nuestro trabajo en el sector del agua? La integración de género no es solo una cuestión de participación, sino de identificar o abordar las barreras que impiden la inclusión social. El género es una parte integral de la GIR por razones de equidad, eficiencia y por la sostenibilidad. Y también tiene que reconocer que las mujeres y los hombres, así como otros grupos, son fundamentales para el suministro, gestión, la gobernanza y la salvaguardia del agua. Por ejemplo, una mayor participación de las mujeres ha demostrado reducir los conflictos transfronterizos, reduciendo los conflictos recurriendo a la negociación y dando prioridad a los beneficios sociales. O sea, por estas razones es tan importante la consideración de integrar el género en nuestro trabajo. ¿Cómo lo hacemos? La pieza de acción de género de GWP es una herramienta útil para la inclusión del género en la JIR. Ofrece 4 áreas de acción para impulsar la igualdad e inclusión de género. El objetivo general es reforzar las pruebas y los argumentos comerciales para la gestión inclusiva de los recursos hídricos. Los datos demuestran los beneficios de la inclusión, pero deben ser mejor utilizados y reforzados para mejorar la aceptación de la gestión inclusiva de los recursos hídricos. Por lo tanto, este no debe verse como una capa adicional, sino como un medio para hacer nuestro trabajo un poco más relevante. En interés de tiempo, no voy a entrar en detalles, pero esta herramienta está disponible en el web de GWP. Aquí pone el enlace. Ok, gracias. Next slide, please. Aquí hay otra herramienta que me parece útil. Son 5 pasos necesarios para planificar, diseñar, aplicar e evaluar cualquier intervención inclusiva del agua. Es muy similar a la pieza de acción de GWP, pero tiene en cuenta también el seguimiento y la evaluación. En cada uno de estos 5 pasos hay que tener en cuenta preguntas específicas sobre qué, por qué y cómo se abordan las necesidades, normas, roles y relaciones de género. Paso 1 es recoger datos específicos de género. Paso 2, incluir en el diseño las necesidades basadas en el género y comprender las barreras. Por ejemplo, a nivel comunitario, tenemos que incluir a las mujeres en el diseño de soluciones, ya que poseen conocimientos sobre prácticas sostenibles en materia de agua. Paso 3, desarrollar material y comunicación que tenga en cuenta los estereotipos y con mensajes inclusivos. 4, aplicación y seguimiento para captar los diferentes impactos, el alcance y la participación. Por ejemplo, garantizar que las mujeres tienen un sitio en la mesa cuando se debate la protección de cuenca transfronteriza, están equipadas con las habilidades necesarias como principales custodios del agua y son posicionadas para aportar soluciones. El paso 5. El paso 5, la evaluación y aprendizaje. Medir los cambios específicos de género en las prácticas y normas, incluidos los no previstos. Es todo un proceso iterativo. O sea, existe una gran cantidad de herramientas Estos son solo dos ejemplos que considero bastante relevante y aplicable a muchos escenarios. Hay una serie de factores favorables a la integración de género en la GIR que se han identificado en varios países. Uno, un compromiso firme con la integración de género entre la dirección ejecutiva en el plano nacional, el género y los marcos jurídicos igualitarios se integran de manera explícita en las leyes, políticas, estrategias relativas a los recursos hídricos. Se asigna financiación para fines específicos a la integración de género en la gestión de los recursos hídricos. Se establecen marcos de apoyo para la participación efectiva y la paridad de las mujeres en la elaboración e implementación de las políticas, programas y los proyectos. Y también se realizan inversiones en educación, concienciación y desarrollo de capacidades. O sea, las herramientas y los ejemplos de las que hablé se encuentran en el paquete de formación que desarrollamos con GWP, que tuvo una gran demanda. Tenemos un significativo número de estudios de casos relevantes para América Latina, así como herramientas útiles. Para más información pueden visitar este enlace. Nuestro plan es que el material y también la formación estén disponibles próximamente en español también. Last slide, please. Ok, gracias por su atención.
Muchísimas gracias, Yasmina. A continuación, te voy a decir dos preguntas que tenemos del público que me mandaron por interno. La primera es, en base a tu experiencia, ¿cuáles son las principales barreras que existen para una participación real de las mujeres en la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos?
Thank you. For me, the main, from my experience, what I've seen is, like also Yumiko touched upon, is this social and cultural structure that really doesn't accommodate for women to be part of these management positions. And it also comes down to the water sector in terms of pursuing professional opportunities and studies, that it's been very male dominated. So there isn't much encouragement for young women, for example, to pursue careers in water and either as engineers or other professions in the water sector. So I think that is kind of one of the main challenges, that there's not this enabling environment from education and onwards that really accommodates women. And it could be either in the location of these positions, that they're not safe, or they're not, let's say, adequate sanitation facilities and so forth. So I think it's really a bottom-up approach, that where it comes from, really the encouragement to pursue those careers, as well as the social implications of the water sector being very male dominated. Thank you.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. Voy a pasar con una pregunta de Marisa Mar en el chat que nos acaba de indicar este momento. Dice, Yasmina, ¿cómo hacer el paso 5? El que nos explicamos hace un momento. La medición, es decir, la medición. ¿Hay ejemplos de medición de las líneas versus el avance? Me refiero a prácticas exitosas. ¿Podrías compartirnos algún ejemplo?
Great question. For us, and really, like I said, this is an iterative process. For us, it's really been a learning process. And I've been pushing this gender agenda for quite some time. And the only way to be able to do step 5, which is monitoring and evaluation, the only way to do it effectively is to have really gender-specific indicators. And the tool that I shared, and the link that I shared, has a specific link, and module 4 of our manual talks about monitoring and evaluation, and really how to create these gender-specific indicators. And like I mentioned, it's not to be considered an additional step to our work, but if we do it at the beginning and have very measurable gender-specific indicators. So how are women affected differently from men? How are children affected differently based on our interventions? And once we have these very clear measurable indicators, we're able then to measure our progress. And it could be either impact that was intended, or sometimes we see that it wasn't. But all of those are only measured effectively through gender-specific indicators. And in that package that I sent the link to, there are very specific and concrete ways in which to design gender-specific indicators and guidelines. And you also feel free to reach out, and I'll be happy to provide further information on that too. Thank you.
Perfecto, gracias. Y Yasmina, una última pregunta que le veo en el chat que está súper interesante, que nos acaba de hacer Andrea Mejía. Dice, ¿cómo podríamos generar sostenibilidad de la participación de las mujeres en la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos fuera de los proyectos específicos? ¿Hay alguna experiencia?
How can we create what, sorry?
Bueno, quiero interpretar esta pregunta. Muchas veces los procesos de género se generan justamente debido a que, o son impulsados por proyectos relacionados a la gestión integrada, pero cuando ya estos proyectos se van, ¿cómo le puedo yo dar sostenibilidad a la participación de las mujeres en la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos? Por ejemplo, en consejos de cuenca, en comisiones, etcétera, que ya no tienen el apoyo de estos proyectos que tienen una visión de género de por sí. No sé si me logré explicar bien.
Yes, so how do we ensure participation and inclusion of women after the project, if I can summarize it very briefly? So what is key for us, at least with projects like CapNet, is that we're no longer needed, right? So we go in, we have an initiative, and then we go out, and it's sustained long after we're gone, right? And so what is critical is really putting down the framework. And from a capacity development perspective, really giving these women who at the end are really the ones who are safeguarding water, the main custodians, really equipping them, one, with the confidence, but also the skills. So confidence to sit at the table and express their needs, and also the skills, not only to manage water, but to be able to really negotiate in a multi-stakeholder environment. And once they're equipped with the necessary skills, then this starts changing the narrative. People are more used to seeing and hearing women's voices. And then, so ideally, we start creating behavioral change. And this goes back to the question of indicators, where we're able to measure that progress. So one, it could be, okay, now today we have 1 woman participating, but in 5 years we have 15. And what has led to that change? So capacity development plays a critical role in this, not only for the skills, but also the confidence. And then really putting a business case forward. So all those top management that are male dominated, making them see that, actually having inclusive participation of women actually makes sense, not only socially, but economically as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I think it is. Muchísimas gracias, Yasmina. Te agradecemos por tu presentación.
Gracias.
Y a continuación voy a darle la palabra a Jennifer Searing, Ella nos va a estar hablando sobre el género, la gobernanza del agua transfronteriza y la diplomacia del agua. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Veronica, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's also a pleasure to talk after Yumiko's and Yasmina's presentation, because they perfectly built the ground for me to basically bring these two fields together, the transboundary level and the importance of gender in integrated water resource management. I want to start with just briefly to define what we mean with transboundary water governance and water diplomacy, because we are always using these terms. Yumiko also has explained it already, but when I talk about transboundary water governance, I really refer not so much to the management, so to the more technical operational decisions, but to the broader governance frameworks that are embedded in treaties or in organizational structures. So that sets the framework for the more operational management and water allocation mechanisms. So it's really more the political level. And we are interested why it is important to include gender here. And then with water diplomacy, which became a very popular term in the past 10 years, we refer then to the processes. So for example, the negotiations, the dialogues, the third-party activities that are in place to for example, come to an agreement, so to a governance mechanisms. And also certainly once you have an agreement or you have a treaty or you have an organization, still there are concrete disputes, disagreements to be solved, to be addressed. So diplomacy is really the very concrete practices of preventing and mitigating and resolving conflicts. So, so it's really talking about the political processes and why it is important to consider gender when we talk about these political decision-making processes on transboundary waters. And now when we think about water diplomacy or transboundary water governance, so basically two fields come together here. So one is the very, let's say, more technical, the water sector, the engineering field, the area of water management, where we have many engineers, where we have people who know the very practical questions of managing water. And we have the field of diplomacy or international relations, where we often have very high-level diplomatic processes, where it's more a social science, people with social science backgrounds, lawyers, and so on, that play a role. So it's two quite different fields that come together and that have to work together in these processes. So often we have also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs being involved and the ministry in charge for water. So these are two quite different fields, but what they have in common is that they are masculinized field. What we call it masculinized means it's male dominated. So Yasmina also referred to it already. So it's fields that were historically and also partly until today, the majority of positions are being held by men. And in diplomacy, it was, for example, until the early 20th century, I mean, just not allowed for women to have diplomatic positions. And then for a long time, it was not allowed for married women to be sent abroad. Yeah, so there was really legal barriers for women, but then there are also many cultural barriers. So when we see photos of water diplomacy events, signing of treaties, basin initiatives, we very often see photos of men. Yeah, so it's often a field where the leadership positions, those who are then at the table, are men. It doesn't mean that there are no women. So often in the background there are women, but the leadership positions are for majority held by men. It's not always like this. You also see here a photo with many women, and that's actually the last ministerial meeting of the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine, where you can see there actually it's a majority of female leadership positions. So it has changed, and it's also immediately more colorful with what they're wearing. But it's still an exception seen globally. So just because we probably all know some women in leadership positions, but it doesn't mean, you know, that the general pattern is still male dominated. And what does this male dominated mean? And I can here also build on what Yasmina already said. It's not only a question of numbers. Yes, one aspect is that we look at how many women are represented. Is there a gender balance in committees, in national delegations, in negotiations? So this is what we call the nominal dimension. Yeah, so this is really to look at representation of men and women, and that's something you can work on to change. But there is also the substantive dimension, yes, and this is that we have certain rules, practices, arrangements that are supposed to be neutral, but they have different implications for men and women, and that are basically barriers that that prevent an inclusion. So you can think, for example, about a thing like duty travel, yes, or for engineers water engineers going to the field is very important. For diplomats, mission abroad is important. So, I mean, that's just a practice, but it's for women who might be young mothers, it's very different to do this than for men. And there are countries and cultures where also women who are not married are just not supposed to go alone somewhere on a field trip or on a visit abroad. So this rule has different gender implications, and it's very important.
Jennifer, ¿se fue el audio de Jennifer? Marcelo, ¿me confirmas, por favor, si se fue el audio de Jennifer?
Sí, se fue el audio de Jennifer.
Ya.
Jennifer.
Could you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now a little bit.
Yeah,
Too low.
there is something with my headset, it seems. Let me try to change. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
I will try to speak up. Sorry, there's a problem with my headset.
No, it's okay now.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry for that. Yeah, so where was I? So some rules that are not meant to be discriminatory towards women or certain gender actually can have this effect. And we can ask, okay, why is this important, and why does it matter, and how does it matter precisely? And that's what we want to find out with gender research. And one point I also would like to mention is that when I say about gender or gender impact, it's important to keep in mind that gender never works alone as a factor, but gender is very closely interrelated with other factors like age, education, nationality, the discipline. So, for example, for me as a woman from, my video was also off, I see. As a European woman with a high education, with a senior position at an institute,
it's different than a young woman, maybe from the global south, who is, still in her early academic career. So that always interacts. But then also, I am also a social scientist working, in the water sector. So our gender is always only part of the roles women and men have in this context, and that's important to keep in mind. So when we say it's important to think about gender, it doesn't mean that now gender, should explain everything or is the only factor we account for. So how gender plays a role in, for example, water negotiations, I want to just explain this to you with an example. And this stems from interviews that we did with water diplomats from different regions who are part of the basin commissions, and with whom we talked about the practices so that they use in negotiations. And they usually defined more confrontational practices, like an aggressive tone, being uncompromising, being very tough, walking out of negotiations, and more collaborative practices. That means seeking compromise, maybe also using informal dialogue to find understanding, avoiding open confrontation. And interestingly, across the regions, usually people have associated these confrontational practices with men and the more collaborative practices with women. And you also see two quotes that just resemble this. It doesn't mean that all men act like this or all women not, but people have this stereotype also. And if you confront them with, you said that there are also women who are very tough negotiators, they would say, yeah, no, but she's an exception. Yeah, but the assumption is that men are more harder and tougher negotiators and women are more collaborative. And that also shapes the expectations, how we expect people to behave in negotiations and what is expected from a water negotiator. And that might make this field also not a, let's say, welcoming field for women, because women in many cultures feel not comfortable to enter these political fields, which have this reputation. They are very tough. People are shouting at each other, and it's not a good environment for women to be. So that also acts as excluding women. And an interesting aspect that we found is also, so when there is a bigger gender balance within negotiation rooms, that actually experts experience that the atmosphere becomes more constructive, so that behavior changes, not because women are per se better or more peaceful people, but also because men change their behavior, because they say, oh, there are women in the room, so we shouldn't be using bad words or shouting very hard. So suddenly the dynamics, the atmosphere in the meeting changed, and it became more constructive and collaborative. And I think Yasmina also referred to this, that there's quite some research that showed that this effect in water, but also in other environments. So this gender equality indeed can positively affect the processes of conflict resolution. I want to finish just with some kind of main conclusions. So just to say that, okay, first of all, transboundary water governance is not gender neutral. And these gender inequalities are not only a question of numbers, but they are really entrenched in the norms, in the institutional arrangements, in the practices of these water cooperation, be it governance mechanisms, be it water diplomacy practices. And they are also part of the socio-political context in which water cooperation happens. So in the cultures, in the political setting of the countries, which then also means that promoting gender equality cannot only be reached by adding women, but it really requires a more structural and transformational change that tackles these structural obstacles. So it's a much more long-term and complex process than having a quota and getting more women at the table. And with this, I come with a few thoughts
for what is needed. And I basically can just build on what Yasmina already said, because she provided some really great examples about how to then really do change. I mean, one part is to really empower women, so to give targeted support to women by networking, mentoring. But this cannot be enough, because if so many obstacles are really structural, then women can have the best leadership capacities. The structures will be the same. So we really also need to assess what is the situation, what are these barriers, and then have very concrete goals and actions, have a budget, the funding for this, monitor them. So I just again refer to the example of CupNet. So I think exactly this is what is needed. And we need an awareness that gender equality is also not a women's thing, but it's really for all. So I think we really also need to include men in the process to achieve this. So with this, I thank you. I just used my last slide for some self-promotion, sorry, but it's a book that we just published a few weeks ago, and it is available also open access. So for those who read English, you're welcome to also have a look. And there are case studies from all over the world and also interviews with practitioners on their experience in water diplomacy. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Jennifer. Una excelente presentación, un abordaje que no muchas veces estamos acostumbrados a verlo en el contexto transfronterizo. Súper interesante, y les invito también a leer el libro de Jennifer, está muy, muy interesante. Ahora voy a pasar a un par de preguntas que nos hacen. Bueno, Marisa la hace directamente en inglés y dice, it seemed to me important to visibilize these attitudes when women are part of negotiations and all your other conclusions. Thanks. Well, era un comentario, it is a comment. I have another question. Tengo otra pregunta que me llegó en interno con respecto a que si tienes algunos consejos con respecto a cómo generar un ambiente más igualitario en términos de género en los lugares donde están predominados de hombres adultos, ¿no? Es decir, de estas generaciones más antiguas que les cuesta un poco adaptarse a estas nuevas visiones de género, que ven esto del género como un requisito, incluso molestoso, ¿no? Esa es una pregunta, Jennifer, por favor.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. Indeed, something that also was visible in our studies, that it's also very much a generational question. So it's an older generation also of men, and we also don't want to treat all men alike as one group, but there are also many differences. So what we saw, I mean, what really made a difference is also what happens at the national level, because at the end, transboundary water governance is shaped by also the national delegation. So when you saw that, I mean, for example, in the Rhine, which I think it's a nice case, because then it started that some countries really had gender quotas in their ministries. So they had more and more women in the delegations, and that then changed, the whole, the whole structure of the commissions and the different working groups. And other countries in the basin were also a bit slower, but these really national policies, gender quotas, legal regulations, that also impacted then the transboundary level. And what we also saw is that once the approach opened up a bit, so I think IWM is also already an approach that is broader. So suddenly you do not only have hydro engineers at the table, but you also have biologists and lawyers and people from environmental sciences. And then you have disciplines where you have also more women. So then it also opens up, let's say, more or less automatically, just because you broaden also the disciplines that you bring into the discussions.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. Y bueno, tenemos una última pregunta también por interno. si en base a tu experiencia consideras tú que las mujeres en cierta manera han tenido que tomar ciertas actitudes masculinas para poder estar más seguras y tranquilas a un nivel de conversación diferente con los hombres, ¿no?
Yeah, indeed. So I also had the quote, and sorry, I think I didn't refer to it when I spoke, of one woman in the Rhine Basin who also said she actually took acting lessons to learn how to negotiate in a male fashion. So because but she's also from an older generation, so she did this like 20, 30 years ago, where she really had the feeling, I have to adapt in order to survive in this field. And I think this is the question. So do you need to adapt to something, or do you want to say, okay, we want things also just being done differently, you know, and maybe we don't need to have this shouting culture in a meeting. And I think that's something that then more opens up and can change when there are more women. So when it's not one woman who is like fighting alone for her, but once you have a critical mass, then it's also, I think, easier to challenge also these norms that have been established earlier.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias, Jennifer. Ahora voy a darle la palabra a mi colega Araceli, quien va a liderar el espacio de recomendaciones finales por parte de nuestras ponentes. Araceli, por favor.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Gracias a las expositoras, nos han dado sus visiones sobre la relación entre género y agua desde diferentes perspectivas. Nos recordaron siempre que hay retos enormes todavía en cuanto a la participación y a la representación en la toma de decisiones. Nos llaman a la atención sobre la existencia de muchos desafíos que nos ubican todavía en estos retos que debemos abordar. Además nos mencionan que las condiciones concretas de las estructuras sociales y culturales, y a veces, como mencionaba, de nivel generacionales, han limitado y limitan el entorno adecuado para mejorar significativamente los aspectos de género en la participación. Nos hablaron también de la importancia que las mujeres desarrollen confianza y habilidades necesarias para poder negociar con diferentes actores, y con ello vamos a acostumbrar a oír las voces de las mujeres. Me encantó esa apreciación que hizo Dasmina. Nos recuerda también que no solo son los números de la participación, pero esta dimensión sustantiva, donde las reglas y particularmente las prácticas y los arreglos promueven la participación. La igualdad en la gestión diplomática del agua requiere un cambio sustancial que aborde los obstáculos estructurales. Mucha otra información que creo que para todos es de mucha utilidad, para todos los que estamos escuchando este webinar, para que desde nuestros trabajos podamos reflexionar sobre las potenciales acciones que se pueden emprender, ¿no?, para alcanzar o influenciar de alguna manera y contribuir a la igualdad de género. Para finalizar, deseo plantear 3 preguntas a las expositoras, por favor. Las preguntas son 3, les voy a leer y después cada una de las expositoras les voy a agradecer me den respuesta. La primera pregunta es, ¿cuál considera que podría ser la mayor ventaja de integrar el enfoque de igualdad de género en la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos? Además, ¿cuáles son los principales riesgos de no hacerlo, de no integrar un enfoque de igualdad de género? Y finalmente, si ustedes nos pueden dar una recomendación desde su perspectiva para los participantes del curso y, bueno, los asistentes de este foro, que son parte, digamos, de actores claves en la gestión de las cuencas transfronterizas entre Colombia y Ecuador, ¿no? Una recomendación final en términos más amplios. Entonces, le voy a pedir primero a Yumiko que nos ayude con estas 3 preguntas, por favor.
Okay, thank you very much for the final question. So I would say, what are the biggest advantage of integrating this gender aspect? I would say it's really understanding the diversity of views and situations, because I think, and it's actually ultimately the water management, transboundary water management, the success also comes down to all different types of users of that water, and also the populations living along the rivers and so on. So I think more diverse views that you integrate, I think that really makes your management robust. So I would say that's really the advantage, and the opposite disadvantage is that if you forget about that, you actually forget about some of the key important water users, and also the decision making as well. And I think another aspect that we also learned is from today's presentation, particularly with Jennifer, is like there's opportunity actually that to integrate women into some of the negotiations and so on. And then if you forget about that, then you might miss that kind of opportunity where some kind of different ways of agreeing things could have been made, but that you might miss that opportunity. So I think those are the perhaps the answering to the first and second questions. And then I think for the last question, what would be the suggestion to really also think about diversity in terms of the different contexts, the diversity, how you include the diversity, and what makes that diverse inclusion make sense is very context specific. To some extent, there are some general recommendations people can make, but how you would do this in Japan, for instance, would be very different in Ecuador, Colombia. So I think you know the context the best. Speak to different people, and maybe the answer would lie to those conversations that you have, and then maybe you might find something that you didn't think of just by reading the books or attending the webinars. So that would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Yumiko. Por favor. Hola. Perdón, por favor, le voy a pedir ahora a Yasmina si nos puede ayudar con sus respuestas.
Yes, of course. Thank you. I would say for me, the biggest advantage is really making sure that once you have this gender component, you really secure a longer term impact, because then all the stakeholders and end users are taken into account. Their needs are heard, their voices are heard and addressed at the design stage. So for instance, barriers to access are identified, and whatever water management initiative you embark on, it can really address those, or at least you're aware of them during the implementation. And this ideally would then change the status quo and then trigger that transformational change that Jennifer alluded to earlier. The main risk, like Yumiko said, really is leaving behind, some key stakeholders. And effectively, if you don't integrate, let's say, women or girls, you're leaving behind 50% of the population and also you're not capitalizing on this key knowledge. And so the main risk is the duplication of efforts, having to go back and either redesign the initiative, not achieving that impact that you had hoped for, and rework log frames and so forth. So, for example, we saw that drilling of boreholes without the consideration of women or girls as the main custodians, if they're not equipped with the necessary skills to operate or maintain this infrastructure, or let's say it's the location of it is far and not secure, poses serious risk. So it's not just at the level of not achieving impact, but you could actually put parts of the population at risk by not taking them into account. So ideally, any initiative is really done through this consultative process to actually meet the needs of the end user. And so whatever investments that are done are actually worthwhile. And then finally, my recommendation would be really just budget, adequately budget for gender integration in your work, really to ensure that you have the resources to map the barriers, you are able to create clear gender specific indicators to measure your progress, and perhaps what may seem more important, or what I have found that's really a tool that convinces everybody else, is really identifying these clear economic and social benefits, which are really the most convincing business case to ensure that you have this effective transboundary cooperation where people see really the benefits of having this really inclusive and integrated approach. Thank you.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Jasmina. Muy interesante, muy amable. Y ahora le voy a solicitar a Jennifer, por favor, que me ayude con las 3 respuestas a las preguntas clave. Por favor, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think again, Yumiko and Jasmina mentioned the most important points. So I don't want to repeat them, but I with the first question, what would be the biggest advantage? I think indeed to bringing the diversity of perspectives is very important, but I just also want to underline that it's also not only a matter of advantage or bringing benefit. I mean, it's also just a matter of human rights. Yeah, so women should be at the table. So even if it wouldn't bring any advantage, we still, you know, should fight for gender balance. So, but for strategic reasons, it's certainly also important to stress that indeed it brings an advantage also to projects, and it just decreases the risk, linking it to your second question, that you have outcomes that are not accepted by society, that something is planned that is detached from reality because you didn't hear the different voices from the target group or people who are concerned by this. And then if you have, yeah, unjust outcomes or outputs at the end, you know, it can also then lead to conflicts in the worst case. So I think indeed having, you know, more stakeholders at the table, and be it here, we are now talking about gender, but you could also say, you know, talk about young and old people or minorities being included. So it always helps to have this more comprehensive perspective, and also make sure that, you know, whatever is decided indeed addresses the concerns of a broader group. Yeah, on the concrete recommendation, I think there's maybe not much to add on what was already said, but what I would just say is always it's important to be open and to listen, yeah, because something that for you as a person might not be an obstacle, might be an obstacle for others to participate or to have their voice heard. So to always be aware that rules, practices, certain arrangements are never neutral, but that they have different effects for different people. So just to keep this open-mindedness and also question routines and how, you know, things have always been done, and be aware that, you know, for some people it might be a problem, and or they might have a different ideas how to do things, and be open to that.
Listo, muchas gracias a las 3 expositoras, fueron muy interesantes sus respuestas. Le doy el escenario ahora a Verónica.
Muchísimas gracias, Araceli, muchísimas gracias, Yumiko, Yasmín, Jennifer. Creo que han sistematizado de una forma bastante concreta las ideas generales que creo que muchos de nosotros tenemos con respecto al género y la GIR, ¿no? Que a veces tenemos ideas sueltas, pero al fin de cuentas creo que han sintetizado súper bien. Muchísimas gracias. A continuación, le quiero dar la palabra, ya las palabras de cierre, a Gina Pantoja, quien es la especialista en género del proyecto binacional. Gina.
¿Aló? ¿Me escuchan?
Sí, te escuchamos.
Vale. Ok, perfecto. Bueno, pues muchas gracias con todas las personas que nos han acompañado en esta jornada para tomar este webinar de género, la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos en el contexto de aguas transfronterizas. Un invaluable agradecimiento a nuestras ponentes, Yumiko, Yasmina y Jennifer, que con su invaluable conocimiento nos han brindado en esta jornada para lograr comprender que necesitamos en realidad tener mayor igualdad de género en la gobernanza de aguas transfronterizas. Agradecerles pues también a nuestros socios de Global Warner Partnership por estas excelentes expositoras, Y bueno, pues para mí es como muy grato cerrar este webinar, esperando que todas las personas participantes hayan disfrutado y aprovechado estos conocimientos de esta jornada. Que tengan un excelente día.
Muchísimas gracias, Gina. Agradecemos a todas y todos por su participación. Tenemos la base de datos de las personas que se registraron. Podríamos compartir con ustedes algunas de las presentaciones de hoy. Solamente pedirles a las personas que son parte del curso, ya que terminamos a tiempo hoy con el foro, si se pueden conectar a las 4 de la tarde para dar continuidad al material, al desarrollo del material del curso. Espero que esto no sea ningún inconveniente para ustedes. De igual modo, les voy a pasar un correo ahora con el enlace. Gracias a todas y todos y espero encontrarnos en una próxima ocasión. Buena tarde.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes.
Gracias con todos.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Yumiko.
Gracias.